Welcome, everyone. Happy New Year. And I'm very pleased to have you here with us for episode 91 of This Is CDR, our first episode of 2024. This Is CDR is a program of OpenAir, an online event series intended to explore the range of carbon removal solutions currently being researched, developed, and deployed, and to contextualize them for policy proposals that OpenAir seeks to advance at every level of government here in the U.S., as well as in national and subnational jurisdictions globally. My name's Toby Bryce. I'm based in Brooklyn, New York, and I work on policy and market development with OpenAir. If you haven't done so already, please say hello in the chat, introduce yourself with your location and affiliation if you'd like. Love to hear who's here tuning in, and everyone else would as well. So please direct that message to everyone and not just hosts and panelists. Quick background on OpenAir if you're not familiar with us, and I put a couple links in the chat. We are a distributed volunteer network dedicated to the responsible advancement of carbon removal. We are a growing global community. We work together on shared open source projects that we call missions in the areas of policy, innovation, communications, and activist market development. Again, there's a link in the chat to our website and a missions page where you can kind of check out the various projects we have going. We have a few dozen probably live projects, and again, ranging across those 4 areas. So lots to do, lots to work on. You can start your own projects. We're an open source community, so we'd love to have you to sign up for our group and be a part of what we're doing. As always, new year, same definition. We want to define our terms. This is a definition of carbon removal from a great resource called the CDR Primer, cdrprimer.org, and I'll put that link in the chat in a second. It's also essentially the same definition that the IPCC uses for CDR, so it's one that we think is important to work with. Purposeful human activity to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and durably store it in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs or in long-lived products. As always, again, 2 important points to make whenever we talk about CDR is number 1, to disambiguate it from CCS, carbon capture, which typically means capturing CO2 from a post-combustion emission source. And that in most cases is an emissions reduction and not carbon removal. So it's not removing CO2 from the atmosphere. It's taking emissions from removing CO2 from the emissions side of the ledger, which is really important distinction to make. Number 2, it's really important to call out loudly and clearly that CDR is in no way, shape, or form any sort of substitute for reducing emissions. Our strong priority, 90+% of our climate work needs to be on decarbonization and reducing emissions. That needs to be really the strong focus. CDR cannot detract from that focus. That said, there's clear scientific consensus that we need CDR at gigaton scale, billions of tons per year by mid-century. Number 1, to neutralize the residual emissions that we can't eliminate in a climate relevant timeframe in the next few decades. And these are potentially from some industrial sources and agriculture, but this is going to be billions of tons per year. And the other reason we need CDR is in the second half of the century, we're going to have trillion+ tons of anthropogenic CO2 in the atmosphere that we already see is causing deleterious effects to our climate. And we're going to need the capability to remove that at massive scale to kind of stabilize the climate once we've gotten to net zero. So CDR is really important. It's an essential climate tool. It is not a substitute for reducing emissions or decarbonization. And we need to work on both. And that's a really important point to make. Super excited for today's episode. We are here and welcoming 2 members of our RMI CDR team. The RMI CDR team published a really tremendous piece of work called the Applied Innovation Roadmap for CDR in November, I believe, of 2023. It's a several 100-page slide deck. It is fantastic detail. We're going to learn about it today, and very excited to have Rudy Kahsar and Gloria C from RMI here with us. And please come on, and I'm going to read a quick introduction of both of them, and then we'll get started. And sorry, I have to find this. Mega, unfortunately, is unable to join us today, so I'm doing both roles. Dr. Rudy Kahsar is the manager of RMI's Climate Aligned Industries CDR team. Prior to joining RMI, Rudy led the Renewable and Sustainable Energy track in the Masters of Environment program at UC Boulder, where he taught classes in energy policy, energy systems and technologies, data science and visualization and energy, the energy-water nexus, and the international energy and sustainability. Before that, he served as an American Association for the Advancement of Science Policy Fellow in the DOE. He's also worked in energy consulting, focusing on measurement and verification, energy efficiency, and renewables integration for the oil and gas and electricity sector. Rudy's PhD focused on heterogeneous catalysis with applications in bio-based fuels and chemicals. Also super excited to have Dr. Gloria C with us. Gloria is a senior associate on RMI's Climate Aligned Industries team, working on CDR pathways with a focus on biogenic approaches. Gloria is an electrical engineer and has worked on hardware and model development for precision agriculture, photovoltaic devices, environmental monitoring in museums, and wearable sensors. She's also has experience in business development, academic research, entrepreneurship, and sustainable product development, including field research in India and Tanzania. Gloria earned her PhD in electrical and computer engineering from the University of Illinois and an MS in electrical and computer engineering from UMass Lowell. So super excited to have Rudy and Gloria here with us. I am going to unshare my screen so that they can share theirs, and go ahead and get started.
All right, thanks, Toby. Can you all see this? Looks good?
Looks good.
Great. So thanks, I'll just say up front for having us here. We're really excited to share some of the work we've done on the Applied Innovation Roadmap, some of the stuff that we're doing with our team. I wanted to start before jumping straight into the Applied Innovation Roadmap, just to give everyone a little bit of framing of RMI, our organization, formerly Rocky Mountain Institute, kind of where we come from, and our approach to the energy transition, because I think this helps frame sort of why we did the Applied Innovation Roadmap in the first place and what we were trying to accomplish with it. So RMI is a think tank. Really the way we think about it is a think and do tank, which is not just thinking about things, but also instantiating them in the real world. So there's a piece of this where we think a lot about, what could a vision of the future look like? And then what do we need to do to test that vision and then actually make that vision happen? And this is the think, do, scale that I'm showing here on this slide. And so as it pertains to our team on CDR, we take the same approach. And our CDR team here at RMI was founded in the summer of 2022. And we've grown quite quickly. There's a lot of interest in CDR. Our goal as a team is really to help CDR succeed as a technology space, right? I think we all, we all know what, how important CDR is going to be in the overall climate picture and what we need to accomplish going out to 2050. Toby just gave a very nice intro that sort of summarized that. And so in order to get there, we need to be really deliberate in the steps that we take along the way. So for our team in particular, since we've founded, we've published a number of academic papers, some insight briefs, obviously the Applied Innovation Roadmap. We're a recipient of one of the DOE's DAC Hub funding, which our hub is called Anchoron. And then we're also, we have a wing of RMI called Third Derivative that is a startup incubator. So looking at helping CDR startups succeed. And then beyond that, the scale piece where we're looking at policy and everything beyond. So with that little bit of framing, let's jump into the AIR. So the Applied Innovation Roadmap was something that we worked on our team over the course of about a year, but it really built on some academic research and work and road mapping work that our team had done really over the course of, I would say, 2 to 3 years. And this is even preceding the formation of an official team here at RMI. So it's the culmination of a lot of work, and we've included obviously a lot of material in it. Looking across what the AIR is, hopefully you've all had a chance to flip through and kind of see what's in there. But at a high level, it's 400 slides, so it's a lot of content. But about 300 or maybe 320 of them are individual roadmaps of each of the approaches that we've broken out. And these are the approaches that I'm showing here. So, I think the key sort of contribution really is what is necessary for each of these approaches to take them from their current state to what we call technical viability at scale. And our real goal there, consistent with those first slides that I just showed, is, we can think about what the future should require, kind of how we get there. What are the steps? What are the critical path steps that we need to take to incubate each of these approaches along that critical path journey? So this is the layout of all of the approaches and how we've broken them up. I think the thing that I want to emphasize here, in approaching this conversation and dissemination of the Applied Innovation Roadmap in this forum, we obviously can't go into all of the details of what's in there because there's just so much content. But I think what I'd really like to accomplish with the time we have, and hopefully through the questions, is just to help give all of you who are here on the webinar today and who watch asynchronously in the future, just a little bit of frame of like what's in here and what are the sort of like key contributions that we've added to the CDR space. And I think one of them that jumps out on this slide is our taxonomy. So we have these three buckets: biogenic CDR, geochemical CDR, and synthetic CDR. And this was, I think you all are probably familiar with this if you're at all involved in the CDR space. People get very heated about taxonomy, and we've found that in having conversations about taxonomy, people have a lot of different opinions on how you should kind of look at it, how you should slice things up. What we've done in the Applied Innovation Roadmap, and this is sort of at the core of how we've organized it, is we've built these three major buckets of CDR and then separated out storage of CO2 as a separate sort of set of approaches. And I've included the definitions here. You can read through these, but I think the major thing to emphasize, at least for now at a kind of high level, is that the way we've organized these is based on what we call a key input to each of these types of CDR. So for example, our biogenic approaches are really any approach that requires sustainable biomass as an input. Geochemical CDR is anything that requires alkaline minerals as an input. And then synthetic CDR is anything that requires low carbon energy as an input. And part of our hypothesis here, and the reason that we've divided out the space this way, is that we think, in the long-term scaling of CDR, these key inputs are going to be, in some sense, key constraints on how much of any given CDR we can deploy. So if you're looking at, for example, a set of different biogenic approaches, they might all be competing for similar supply of sustainable biomass, and that's going to determine the total amount of those types of approaches you could deploy. So that's kind of general frame in terms of how we've broken up the taxonomy, and you'll see that reflected as you flip through all of the different sections of the AIR. So just to zero in on biogenic and give you a little more taste of what this looks like, at the start of each of our four major sections, so biogenic, geochemical, synthetic, and storage, we've included some framing slides. And essentially what these are is to describe essentially what I just mentioned, which is what is the key input and what is the total sustainable supply of it in context. And so for biomass, for example, we've built, this figure, and I think there's a couple other slides right around it in the Applied Innovation Roadmap that really look at how much biomass we have today and how much we think we might have in the future. And so the idea here is, there's many other great reports out there that are looking at the total amount of sustainable biomass, how much could total sustainable biomass increase from now till, let's say, 2050 or even 2100. And then where is that biomass currently being allocated, and where could we potentially find some of it to allocate to CDR? And I think biomass is a particularly interesting one when we look across all of our different approaches, because we obviously have a lot of biogenic CDR approaches, and probably many of you on the call are interested in certain biogenic approaches. If you look across the energy transition, so RMI, I'll just say, we're a big think tank. We have a whole team that works on sustainable aviation fuels, and that team thinks that pretty much any biomass you have should be going to make sustainable aviation fuels. Well, sustainable aviation fuels are also not shown on this IEA trajectory out to 2050, right? So, there's a challenge here where the biomass that we have is already being allocated to other forms of, other end uses in the energy transition. And there's several new competing demands coming in that are also going to be looking for biomass. And that, we think, is going to be a real challenge for biogenic CDR to scale in the future. And so this is meant to frame the conversation about the scale that could be achieved and where there will potentially be constraints on that scale. One of the things that we did in order to make our roadmap assessments as sort of definitive as possible about the critical path of what's needed from now until, let's say, commercial scale for any of our given approaches, was to do a detailed assessment of the TRL, or technology readiness level, of each of our approaches, and then basically divide out those approaches based on where they are today and what's needed to look at their critical path from current state to technical viability at scale. And so, if, this slide, I think, does, some description of this in terms of TRL, MRL, what the development stage is, what activities are going on, a brief description. In our appendix, if you're curious about this, we actually have laid out an entire slide to detail what we mean by different TRL levels. And this applies through all of our approaches across the AIR. So, one thing I'll just point to here is to say, if you're really curious about the details and the technical assessments we did, please scroll to the end and look at our appendix, because there's a lot of really good content in there of our methodology, how we thought about assessing CDR, how we thought about, what's needed and what could be done. Another aspect that you'll see in all of our individual roadmaps is our success stories. The reason that we created these is really to understand what we think is the upper limit of what is possible for deployment. So, as we say here in this caption, the success stories are to gain clarity in the optimistic upper bound given where we are today. And so what we've done is try to keep the deployment trajectories as simple as possible. Typically, what we've done is just say there's a cumulative year-on-year growth rate. And there's usually, for most of our success stories, 2 phases of this. So we have, for example, a high growth rate from now till 2030, 2035, something like that. And then another growth rate that takes us out to 2050. And the reason for doing this is not to say, so this is not a scenario of what will happen, right? This is meant to represent an upper range of what we think is possible. And the reason for putting this in is because we found in having conversations with, all kinds of different organizations that people would quote a number of deployment, say in 2030, that is somewhere up in this range, right? Like people might say, we're going to have a gigaton of DAC in 2030. And, our thinking was, is that actually possible? What kind of year-on-year growth rate would you need in order to achieve that? And so the goal of our success stories is really to say, look, the only way you're going to get something higher than our success story is if you basically choose a growth rate higher than what we have shown in our success story slide. Anything below the curve is going to be accessible within those stated growth rates. So if you want to be up here, you're going to have to violate some of the assumptions that we've laid out, which could be possible, but we think that, the basically limit that we've laid out is pretty aggressive already. So hopefully that helps frame the conversation of what scale could look like. I think the last thing I'll say here before turning it over to Gloria is just sort of what is the structure of this whole thing. So this is, I think, in the very beginning of the Applied Innovation Roadmap, just meant to frame kind of what's in there. We have an introduction, executive summary. I think this will be interesting for a lot of folks to flip through. But the heart of it, the core of the content is these individual deep dives on all 32 of the approaches that we assessed. And for each of those 32 approaches, there's 10 elements that repeat. So we have basically a definition of the approach, summary of the approach, risk assessment, et cetera, all the way down to the actual roadmap, which includes detailed cost, scope, and timeline assessments for pre-demo activities, demo activities, and path boosting activities. And so, with this kind of frame in mind, I'm going to pass it over to Gloria, who's going to take us through an example of one of these to show you all kind of what that looks like.
Thanks, Rudy. You can jump up to that. So we're not going to go into really specific technical detail on these, but I want to make sure everyone has seen an example of one of our approaches so that you know what you're looking at when you dig into the roadmap yourselves, which we highly recommend. It opens up with the intro, a definition, and then we have example scenarios to give people who are unfamiliar with a path a sense of what this might look like in practice. Next slide. And then we have an overview, and this is especially for people who may not be familiar with it or want a really top-level view of where are the highest risk considerations for this path, where do we see as the opportunities for the cost to improve down the line, what is the state of the approach, and so what's happening out in the field, out in the commercial space, and that all informs the roadmap that we use to break down what needs to happen to get this to technical scale or technical viability at scale. And as Rudy mentioned, we have the success story, which helps frame what this could look like. Next one. So the risk assessment is based on originally the carbon negative shots criteria from the DOE. And so that's where some of these, like the secure storage, the pathway to full cost, those numbers that we're assessing against come from. And that gives you an idea of what needs to be overcome and where those efforts should be focused to achieve technical viability at scale. So you can see between a BCDR or a geochemical or synthetic approach, these aren't assessed on the same criteria, partly because we're considering what those critical inputs are going to be, but they all have the same storage, path to measurement, and path to costs assessments. Current state of our D&D. And to start, this is not exhaustive. The field is changing very rapidly. Even at the day we released the AIR, we were getting new information of things that were happening real time. So this is a rapidly evolving space, as I'm sure everyone here is aware. But we want to give a sense of what's happening, what the commercial efforts are, and where are other stakeholders engaging at a financially significant scale. Microalgae and ponds is particularly interesting because we have Brilliant Planet doing microalgae specifically for CDR, but we also have a couple of other companies that are growing microalgae at production scale. And even if they're not using it for CDR, that informs the path forward to produce microalgae in a impactful scale. Other approaches are very focused on only having a few early stage companies, and they don't all have this kind of broader commercial interest, but that's part of what we're trying to show with this current state of who else is in play for this specific approach. Next slide. We go into our roadmap, and because microalgae, again, is kind of a unique case, we don't actually have pre-demonstration work and stage gates that we need to assess criteria against to say, this looks like a viable pathway, let's move it to the next phase. We have other approaches that have pre-demonstration work. We have some that are pre-demonstration in parallel with demonstration, again, depending on that critical path assessment of what is needed to determine, does this approach meet the criteria to advance to more deployment or more demonstration so we can get it to deployment. We also have these path boosting activities, and these are not critical paths. So this does not have to happen to assess that this approach is viable, but they're an opportunity to advance or accelerate the deployment of a specific approach. And then we go into our specifics. What are the actual work streams that are recommended to assess these projects or these approaches? In this case, we know that we can grow algae, but can we do it in a sustainable way that meets the costs and the deployment that we view as critical to be technically viable? And the key gaps here between what's happening is also the burial and the measurement. And so these are criteria that we're assessing all of these pathways against. The next slide shows our path boosting. And one of the key things here, as you can see in yellow, are opportunities to support more than one approach in parallel. So in this case, containment monitoring would support biomass direct storage, engineering microalgae growth or conditions could support microalgae growth in the open ocean. So those are particularly powerful because you get a little extra bang for your buck when you're looking at funding these R&D efforts. Next one. And all of that comes together to inform our success story. And as Rudy stated, this is not something that we're saying will happen. This is not an expected deployment, but it is an optimistic projection. What would happen in a best case scenario where all of this funding comes together and all of these demonstrations are successful and move the approach forward to deployment at scale. And next one. So as I mentioned, stuff is happening very fast in the field. We'd love to have you guys keep in touch, keep us apprised of what you're working on. If you're interested in collaborating or you have feedback to offer, all of our contact information is there, so please feel free to reach out. I believe we are going to turn it over for questions, but I also did want to plug the OpenAir t-shirt that Toby mentioned. It's my favorite. It's very soft. Definitely get your own. And then Toby, over to you. I think you are moderating the questions.
Indeed. That was great. Thank you guys both so much. Thank you for wearing your OpenAir t-shirt. I just put a link to that again in the chat. It is a very cool t-shirt. Yeah, so in the audience, if you do have questions, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we will start getting to those in a few minutes. Maybe just taking a step back. I mean, it's such an amazing resource, and I mean, many people have read it, but if you haven't looked at this, please do. It will take some time. It's like 370 slides, but it's densely packed with information and super valuable. And so thank you for all of your work on it. And I know it was a lot of work. And I want to ask about that. I mean, how long did it take? Where did the idea come from? How did you go about attacking such a massive project?
Yeah, I'll start with a little bit of the history. In a way, we have the luxury, being at a think tank where we get to think about things. And when this project started out, our goal was to help inform critical path activities for the approaches that could really get us to the scale we need in 2050 and 2100. And so we started out trying to actually whittle down the CDR space to only a couple approaches that we thought would really have that potential. But, so I was kind of leading this project through the course of it, and early on had this thought, like, we're only going to be able to do this in a robust way if we actually look at all of the approaches. And so over time, we sort of brought in more approaches until we were really looking at a comprehensive view of the whole CDR space. And I think that's, one of the things that we think is really powerful about the AIR as a publication is that we are comprehensively looking at CDR. So you can, think about approaches compared to each other and where they fit in the CDR ecosystem. And I think that's something that, we wouldn't have been able to do without years of research also preceding it. So prior to there being a team at RMI doing CDR, so I was working within our strategy team working on CDR, and Daniel Pike, who is the founder of our team, was working at a place called the Climate Map with several of our other colleagues who then came into RMI bringing their knowledge and some of their publications. And I would say that the Applied Innovation Roadmap is really a culmination of all of that work being brought together. So, you could say maybe even 2 to 3 years.
Got it. Thousands of person hours. It really is incredible. So we all have our ideas about CDR personally and our priors when we go into new projects. Like, what did you have what was most surprising to you after having done the work, like based on relative to your preconceptions and what you thought about CDR before you had actually created this sort of structured framework for looking at the different pathways? What jumped out at you? Like, what did you, I'm sure you learned a lot, but what was the most surprising thing? I would love to hear that from each of you. Like the most surprising finding or outcome or conclusion. Gloria, why don't you kick?
Sure. One of the things that really changed how I thought about CDR is essentially the carbon efficiency, how much carbon comes in versus how much gets stored. And that is what convinced me that biomass direct storage, so your landfilling or sinking biomass, is actually a potentially really powerful pathway. When I came in, I was not on board, but I did a bunch of math about it, and the numbers convinced me. But that has been interesting. Certainly, I have had some perspective shifts moving through that I would not have anticipated before those thousands of person hours.
Yeah, and I think I would say, I mentioned this just in the little intro I gave, but I think thinking about the whole CDR space, all together and thinking about the constraints on it for its ability to scale, right? I mean, we all hear about how much CDR we need if we're going to hit our long-term goals. And I think the exercise that we went through in looking at what are the key inputs, how fast can we source them and deploy them, and what are the constraints on deploying them, putting into perspective, for example, in biogenic CDR, that if we turned all of the sustainable biomass we have today into CDR, right, at 100% efficiency, you'd get about 10 gigatons a year, right, out of anthropogenic emissions that are like 40, right? So just kind of like putting that all into perspective and scale, and similar for geochemical, similar for synthetic, just to kind of get an idea of like what is really possible within the technical economy that we have.
And to that point, and I think this is on slide, I was just looking at it. So it's towards the end. But basically there's a slide towards the end that talks about how even under a success story scenario, we are not going to get to, and you alluded to this in your comments, but like in your presentation, but we're not going to get to the sort of IPCC indicated scale for aggregate CDR per year until around mid-century. So, and it's all going to, it's going to all going to be about the area under the curve in terms of decarbonization. There was a recent paper that I'll put in the chat from our friend Shuchi Chalati and Emily Grubert about how the use of CDR and how we need to think about how we're using CDR. We can't just use it for any random, offset. Because it's going to be supply constrained for the foreseeable future. What do you think the implications are for policy of the fact that it's going to take time to scale CDR? Like once we get to 2100, we do seem to have, if not infinite, then pretty substantial capabilities in terms of CDR scale. But like in the sort of like net zero target timeframe, we might be somewhat limited. Do you think there are implications for policy and how we might use CDR given that fact, or given that assertion?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll just say this steps outside of the, CDR expertise area that our team is sort of, focused on. And it's really an energy transition question, right? Which is if we're already doing mitigation as fast as possible. And by the way, Toby, I think the slide you were thinking of is 26. If anyone at home has the AIR open, I think you can flip to that. I believe it's slide 26. I think it's this slide, actually. Is this the one you mean, Toby?
Yeah, there was one later that made the assertion explicit, but it's shown here.
Yeah. So this is basically all of our success stories stacked on top of each other and then compared against the C1 and C2 scenarios from the IPCC. And yeah, I mean, I think there's this period from now till 2050 where the amount of CDR that the IPCC says we need, we think is not going to be achievable. And I think, Toby, to your question about allocation, maybe the answer that, I think the talking point that I think we need to really emphasize is that the decarbonization that needs to happen from now till 2050 needs to be absolutely prioritized and as steep as possible to eliminate as many of those emissions as possible, right? And so it's like, if someone wants to use CDR to offset their helicopter emissions, it's like, sorry, you can't do that because we need to be making steel somewhere that cannot be offset, and that needs to have CDR associated with it, right? So probably there are going to be policy, decisions made about how to really keep people focused on reducing emissions in this period from now till 2050. While also ramping up CDR as fast as possible, because we are going to need that, obviously, as well. But I think the answer has to be both of these things need to be prioritized, incubating CDR and decarbonizing as quickly as possible. And then, sort of within that constraint, policy perhaps to incentivize people to keep making that decision explicit.
Yeah. I was just looking. So slide 376 kind of simplifies this one and just shows that the CDR scaling will not hit IPCC targets. Those lines won't cross until around 2050 under the most optimistic scenarios. And I phrased the question very incoherently, I think, but I think the general idea is that it might be the case that the use of CDR should be limited to a rigorously delineated definition of residual emissions, things that we really can't decarbonize in the immediate term, and not just what's cheapest or yes. So anyway, in terms of I asked you about your priors. One of my priors was that ocean alkalinity enhancement, while we had carbon to sea on towards the end of last year and lots of challenges in terms of MRV, we need to assess ecosystem effects. But my prior is if those things check out, then OAE is one of the most scalable pathways, like many gigatons per year of scale potential. And I believe that you guys came to in your even 2100 theoretical max success story to only half a gigaton a year. And I'm wondering, what were the things that in your analysis constrained OAE versus maybe a more popular conception that if we can make it work, it's one of the more scalable pathways.
Yeah. Again, I'll say like looking overall from our taxonomic sort of breakdown, right, within geochemical CDR, where we think about alkaline minerals being a major constraining factor. If you look at our 4 geochemical pathways in 2050, the total amount of alkaline minerals we would need to be deploying is 6.2 gigatons, right? So you deploy more rock, you need to deploy more rock in the environment than the removals you get, because 1 ton of rock might only remove half a ton of CO2 in some cases, right? Obviously, olivine, there's certain rocks that is 1-to-1 or potentially a little bit more. That 6.2 gigatons of rock that our success stories have being deployed in 2050 is pushing up near what the largest commodities currently on Earth today do. So the coal industry today is 8 point something gigatons a year, and that's done in countries all over the Earth, right, with like clear economic pathways. So if we got up to 6 gigatons of rock in 2050, we think that that would be a real success. And that 6 gigaton is distributed over our 4 geochemical approaches. And I think when we look at deployment, we think that terrestrial enhanced weathering, right, so deploying on land, some coastal enhanced weathering are going to take a significant amount of that alkaline minerals. And then if you think about like superficial mineralization using potential waste streams from mining, that's also going to be a significant amount of those minerals. And so for OAE, you're going to be needed doing a lot of basically mining just for rock that you're going to be deploying in the ocean. And it's really going to be pushing the limits of what supply chains we think can accomplish. Another thing I'll just throw in there, and this is where I would encourage you all to really read the footnotes of our success stories. I mean, we really tried to take a like reality check on each of these approaches, and the growth rates that we've put in for our success stories are like 100% year on year for a lot of these approaches over like decades, right? Which is kind of unprecedented in pretty much any industry ever. And so, when you really look at like it's easy for us to throw around gigatons of this, gigatons of that. A gigaton is a lot. And it's hard to emphasize how much a gigaton is. Like the total wheat that the world does is like a gigaton a year, and it's like, that's, it's like foodstuffs that are grown on every continent, right? So achieving this scale is just a tremendous challenge.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Yeah, it was just surprising to me, but it definitely makes sense. So your success stories are also sort of distributing this feedstock, and you did that in the BCDR as well. So you're not assuming whatever biomass burial or biochar or any individual pathways getting it all. You're kind of allocating the feedstock in some way.
Well, I will caveat that, because if you look actually across all of our success stories, for example, for biogenic CDR, and you look at the energy transition demands for biomass that we've shown in our framing materials, it's way over allocated, right? And the point that we're really trying to make is to say, we're not telling you which one of these CDR approaches should win out or what should happen with the rest of the energy transition. We're just trying to say, this is how much biomass we have. And there's all of these approaches that if they scale, technically speaking, as fast as they can use some portion of that biomass, but they probably all can't achieve their success story together because they're going to be competing against each other.
I'm going to go ahead and ask a question that was put in the chat, but because it's related and I think it's a good question. So what about OAE that's created when you're using electrochemistry to create the alkalinity? Like, we're name checking Ebb Carbon here, but there are other companies that do that as well. It seems like you're more bullish on that approach. That your assumptions are, the optimistic assumptions for both DAC and any other energy intensive CDR are that we can achieve massive low cost additional renewable generation. But do you want to speak to the sort of electrochemical OAE approach versus the physical addition of minerals to the ocean?
Yeah, definitely. I don't know, Gloria, do you want to chime in on this?
Just high level, we're treating because those have different inputs, we have split them out separately. So our taxonomy actually has OAE split into mineral alkalinity enhancement, which is what we've been discussing with the mineral feedstock limitations. And then we have indirect water capture, which I think generally people are calling direct ocean capture. And in that case, low carbon energy becomes the key input. And so those are treated with a different success story because we're looking at different inputs. And Rudy, I know you built that success story. I don't know if you have specific highlights that you want to add.
Yeah, no, I think
5214. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Toby. Yeah, I think Gloria's framing is like the first thing that's important is like in our approach, in our taxonomic approach, as Gloria said, of breaking out those approaches that require alkaline minerals from those that require low carbon electricity, because again, we think there's going to be a cap on sort of scalability for those. We've sort of split out the way some people talk about OAE between approaches that deploy rocks and those that use electrochemistry. Within our electrochemistry approaches, as Gloria said, those are our indirect water capture approaches. We think that they have a long way to go in the near term. 2050 is only 26 years away. It's pretty near, right? And like if you look at sort of like the DAC 1.0 companies that were started in the late 2000s, it's been 15 years and we're finally getting, Oxy, whatever, right? It's like we're going to be well into the 2040s before we think electrochemical ocean approaches or these indirect water capture approaches are really hitting that megaton scale. But as you'll see in our success stories, we think that there's tremendous potential in the second half of this century for those to get into the gigaton range, similar to DAC.
And you have a lot of these energy intensive approaches with the, again, optimistic success story by 2100 in the 5 to 10 gigaton range or something.
Exactly.
So that's the thesis. And I'm going to ask one more question. We're getting a lot of great audience questions, and I don't want to hog the mic. Speaking of DAC, one of the things I like many things about your work here, but one of the things I liked about your approach was you very clearly illustrated the fact that direct air capture is not just one monolithic thing. I mean, there are many different direct air capture approaches. You broke it into 10 approaches, which you could argue there could be less, there could be more, but can you talk a little bit about how you kind of broke DAC from this monolithic thing that critics might talk about into the individual approaches, and like what was the thinking behind that? And then maybe the second part of the question, the way that you did the success stories, I think it kind of was uniform for all DAC for the success stories in the 2050 to 2100 range. I think there were some insights maybe into sort of some of the analysis though. Did you see any of the individual DAC approaches that you think are favored in terms of their attributes in one way or another in terms of their potential? So two parts to that question.
Yeah, let me take part one. And I was going to pass to you for part two, Gloria. What do you? Yeah.
You can go.
So for part one of the question, Toby, our team, we have a couple DAC experts on our team. Harthia Haralambos and Sylvan Eschliman have both worked a lot on DAC, as have a number of other people on our team. As I mentioned at the very opening of the webinar, the AIR builds on other road mapping work, other academic papers that we've published. I'm going to share the one in particular here in the chat. Oh, you got it?
Yep.
Thanks, Gloria. Yeah, so this is an academic paper where we go into much more detail about those 10 different approaches that we've broken out, and the AIR really builds on that. So if you're curious about the origins there, some of the groupings have to do with, technically speaking, what's needed. And then Gloria, do you want to take the second part?
Sure. I think the same as we're seeing the differentiation in BCDR comes down to biomass. We're going to have low carbon energy is what will differentiate different DAC approaches. So if you look in the success stories, they are very different based on some of these approaches are significantly more advanced than others right now, but they all kind of converge in the 2040s to 2050s on the approaches that can function with lower energy and essentially higher carbon efficiency are what's going to win out. And I think there's a lot of room for really creative innovation or industrial integration to move that forward. But that's going to be the criteria that separates the winners and the losers in the pack.
It's purely going to be, maybe not purely, but the primary factor is going to be energy efficiency. And the most successful current companies, the incumbent approaches, I mean, they are arguably not very energy efficient. They're in the sort of 2 to 3.5, and I can't do joules, but megawatt hours per ton. Is there like a threshold? Do you think that, again, sorry about the lack of joules, but do you think that approaches need to be below 1 megawatt hour per ton? And we have people like RepAir and Mission Zero who are kind of quoting capability in that range. Like, is there a threshold? Like, is it, I'm sure it's like, dynamic and like it will more efficient is better, but is there kind of a magic number, sort of like the $100 a ton number that you feel like DAG needs to get to work?
We didn't set a number, but if you go through the appendix, we did have risk criteria, and that was we had numerical thresholds of what was low versus up to very high risk. And so we do, kind of have a spectrum of where those fall, but some of it also will come down to what are the competing demands for that energy? Are you deploying it somewhere where nothing else is happening and you can get cheap solar? Or is that someplace where that energy is really high value? And so the deployment changes that calculus as well.
Got it. Lots more questions, but let's move to some audience questions. And everyone, pardon me, because I'm not used to doing all of this solo, but a question from, and apologies also if I mispronounced your name, but Juho Lipponen. A good question, really useful analysis. Thanks for sharing. Out of the 30 plus pathways, where do you see number one, the rapid wins? And number two, perhaps the most important, significant long-term opportunities. I mean, we've alluded to this, but I think really good highlights to maybe call out again, and maybe one example of each he asked for.
I would say rapid wins are going to be in the biogenic space. That's stuff we know how to do. And a lot of the obstacles are getting process improvements and good MRV. So if you're looking at timber as carbon storage, you can't quantify that very effectively. But if we can really tighten up that seed to grave LCA, there's an opportunity to make timber really powerful. Same thing with durable storage and living biomass. Those are all things we could deploy right now. We are deploying them, but we need to be able to quantify what's going on and understand how to scale them in an impactful way.
Yeah. And I would say, honestly, something similar. I think Gloria and I, another person on our team, we had a conversation yesterday with a startup. They were talking about wood burial biomass, what we call biomass direct storage. And the person was saying, basically, it's like, there's not a lot to sell on this. It's like we're taking wood and we're burying it. and obviously it's more complicated. And some of you probably are experts in this and have studied a bit more, figuring out the MRV, making sure that it's actually, not decomposing in a way that's producing methane. Like there are some complicating factors to it. But I think, biomass direct storage is a great example of something where it's like, we can do that tomorrow. We don't need major innovations. We already have, there's not a lot of technical know-how we necessarily need. We have trucks, we have chainsaws, we can cut down trees and bury them. So anyway, I think that's a real good near-term one. And I would say long-term, the one that really jumped out to me as having potential are the indirect water capture approaches. So, there's a real advantage there if those approaches can come down in their energy, or basically improve their energy efficiency, come down in their energy use, where I think they could be really competitive and really scalable.
Great answers. And just for reference, and this is one of the sections that one of the first ones I read because I do some work on it, but the section 2.1 biomass direct storage, slide 48, is a really, great, it's very easy to understand illustration, I think, of the framework. And you get to your success story there, 2100 is 400 megatons per year, which is kind of like, that's one that really aligned well, I think, with my priors, because like with all the competing uses of biogenic feedstock, that might be where this one ends up. Question here from Poppy Russell about biogenic feedstocks. You're indicating, as you just alluded to, a heavy reliance on BCDR up until 2050, reaching 10 gigatons CO2 per year, but also indicate that there's only 10 gigatons CO2 worth of sustainable feedstock available. Can you please discuss a bit more how you view this pathway scaling given the competing uses for biomass? And I guess you could even talk about non-CDR uses for this biomass as well.
Yeah, there's so much to be said about this, right? It's a interesting question. I think this is something the field is going to sort out. I'll say a couple things to begin with. So one of the pathways that, approach areas, I should say, that we included in the Applied Innovation Roadmap is our very first one, which is what we call living biomass. And if you look at the potential for living biomass, so this is like soils, forest, afforestation, reforestation, mangroves, things like this. If we can figure out how to manage and credit those properly, they have tremendous potential for removals. We haven't obviously cracked that yet at a global level, but I believe half of the removals that we're showing in 2050 are in living biomass, right? So that's, first of all, very significant and very, I would say, not certain that we're going to achieve that, right? Of the other 5 gigatons, yeah, I mean, I think this is an open question where there's going to be competing demands across the energy transition. I think, BECCS or biomass to liquid fuels is another really key competitor for biogenic CDR. Obviously, there's going to be people that promote BECCS pathways that want to do both. They want to both do CDR and energy out of the biomass that we have. There's going to be I would say, market competitiveness to that, just because if you're selling a fuel or selling electricity, there's going to be people that want to invest in that and want to try it. We think that, approaches like biomass direct storage are just going to be more carbon efficient in terms of, if you're looking at price per ton removed, they're going to probably outcompete some of the other ones. But I think the short of it is there's going to be a competition for biomass, we think, going out to 2050. And it's really, unclear at this point how it's going to play out. In the best case scenario, the 5 gigatons a year is what we think could happen, but that would be significantly cutting into other uses of biomass.
And I can sort of answer my own question, but how does the AIR think about residual biomass versus dedicated cultivation of biomass as a feedstock? I mean, unfortunately, we don't have great estimates, but there are a couple few gigatons of wood residues globally, and maybe 5-ish gigatons of crop residues globally. To Poppy's point, and that's going to run out. Do you think about dedicated cultivation of biomass for some of these pathways? I guess we talk about out, but
we do, yes. Yeah. And then you can look at that in things. We have it in direct storage. We have it in biochar, bio oil, and I think in the BECCS pathways as well. You can get to this point with waste biomass, and then once you have to start using dedicated biomass, that changes these other calculations, because you're now looking at different considerations for dedicated water use and fertilizer use and land use. And so that did inform the risk assessments across the biogenic pathways.
And do the success stories for the marine ones, but for the terrestrial ones, BCDR pathways, or do any of the success stories contemplate dedicated cultivation, or are they using only residues?
No, they're definitely contemplating cultivated in order to, again, that's optimistic. We are, in the best case scenario, we have adequate feedstock in a sustainable way to get to this scale.
Changing gears a bit, there's a good question here from Jake Harrison. And I believe the answer is no, but it's an interesting thought. Do you spell out recommendations for different geographies? Just considering the heterogeneity of availability of cheap power, biomass, mineral feedstock, et cetera. How do you think geography should play into how we're thinking about these roadmaps?
We do include that in a pretty high level, again, largely in the risk assessment. Water requirements or humidity requirements for Pathway X are high, and so this should not be deployed in a place at risk of water stress. We don't go into specific recommendations, more of a avoid it here. This increases your risk profile significantly. But those are some pretty significant considerations that I think we would like to build on in the future, but I will leave that future forecasting commentary to Rudy.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I love it because I also find this question very interesting. As Gloria is alluding to, we are thinking about it. And thinking about, if we were going to achieve our success stories as we've laid them out, which, by the way, they're a technical assessment, right? So what's missing from them? Well, first of all, this question, right? Where are you going to do it geographically on Earth? There's many other things, right? Which regions of Earth have policy environments that are favorable for deploying certain types of approaches? Which regions have favorable, communities that would be welcoming of this, and what kind of community engagement would you need, right? There's so many more non-technical questions that also need to be sorted out to figure out where you could actually deploy the scale of CDR that we've laid out in our success stories. And I think, that's something that's going to play out just naturally over time. And we're going to learn as we attempt to deploy CDR, which is, I think, the number one thing that we're advocating for in the Applied Innovation Roadmap, which is let's do demos. We need to see how these things work in practice and start learning and see how people receive them, see how well they work, et cetera, et cetera. And that'll start to sort itself out. But I think as we head down that pathway, there is this question of, which geographies have potential? Where should we be targeting? And within our individual roadmap slides, we've actually laid out some funding, requirements to basically look into that.
That kind of leads, I think we're almost out of time, but want to kind of close with a final question. There are slides in the AIR that talk about gaps. Like these are things we are not doing. And then there's, I think, some slides toward the end that talk about potential next steps. Can you tell us about, how you see this work evolving? How do you see it kind of carrying forward? Does RMI have concrete next steps planned? And then also just from both of you, like what is just based on your work on this, what is the final word that you would want to leave the audience with, just as they kind of contemplate this project? Gloria?
I will again hand it over to Rudy for the next phase of things, because I don't know what's planned and what's public. But as far as what I would leave people with is, get involved. These success stories are, like we said, optimistic, but that needs people in here doing stuff. I know there's a lot of great comments of what people are working on. I joined OpenAir to start working on Project Viridian. So find a spot to get involved and start working on it. There's so much opportunity to help, push those deployment curves up. And these early stages are so critical in order to accelerate that curve down the line.
Yeah, I do think that AIR is such a powerful illustration of a portfolio approach and the need for a portfolio approach, and also the fact that a portfolio approach is achievable because all of these different pathways are calling on different kinds of resources. And so there are things that we can be working on in parallel. So I think that's a really great point. Rudy, like and then also kind of what would you like to leave the audience with in terms of like big takeaway?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the way that I sort of started framing the Applied Innovation Roadmap sometime in last year is that it's a menu of all the things that you could select from if you were a funder, right? So it's not telling you which ones of these things you should fund. That's something else that we are working on is like, okay, we've given you a menu. It's like you just went to the restaurant and there's like 1,000 things on the menu. You don't order one of each thing, right? Maybe you actually want to order 3 orders of dumplings because you love dumplings, right? And that's the kind of thing that we're looking at doing next is what's the prioritization of what's on this menu that we want to select. So, I think in terms of our next steps as what's coming after the AIR, we're looking to basically assess sort of, which of those things we should be investing in now, what's the sort of priority, who needs to be doing them, and trying to generate the buy-in and getting funders signed up to actually start doing some of these things, right? So we've basically done a lot of thinking about what we think needs to be done. Now we're in a phase of action, right? It's like, who's going to fund this stuff? What are we going to take away next? What are we going to do next? What's next on the menu? I think that the thing I would leave everyone with, and I think this is something that comes out the more time you spend with the Applied Innovation Roadmap, and obviously Gloria and I have spent a lot of time with it, is that if we were to do anything, we need to demonstrate as many of these different approaches as quickly as possible and start learning how they work in the real world. So if you have an ability to deploy a demonstration scale project of a new type of approach or a new sort of like geography, a new sort of like, I don't know, type of inputs for a certain approach, just the more that we can begin deploying CDR in the field and learning about how it works technically, what we need to learn non-technically in terms of policy needs, community engagement, all of that, I think is like the main thing that needs to happen as soon as possible.
Excellent. Excellent last words. Thank you both for being here with us today. And it was super, super interesting. And like, I love the discussion. And I really do. We put the link in the chat about 10 times, but the work is definitely worth spending some time on and time with. And it will take some time because it's substantial and it's very like in depth. So definitely take a look and spend some time on it. And thank you for being with us. I'm gonna very much appreciated. I'm going to share my screen just to kind of close out with a few programming notes. But we have actually the only one where the registration is live is Banyu Carbon. We're taking a couple weeks off, but Banyu Carbon is coming on Jan 30. They're a photoelectric approach. I can't remember what section of the AIR they fall in, but they are covered. And photoelectric direct ocean removal. Super interesting University of Washington professors who have started this company, recent frontier purchase. They're coming on January 30th. So that's the next one. So please, there's a link in the chat to register. And thank you again to the audience for being with us, for all your great questions. And Rudy and Gloria, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for having us, Toby.
Everyone be well, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.